Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
God's existence, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the truth of the Catholic Church. What evidence do we have? Gentlemen, welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show for part 2 of our roundtable discussion. I had just a wonderful good time chatting with the two of you in part 1, and the conversation took many different directions, but then we decided let's get back together and maybe present something a little bit more formal as three people who are Catholics, me coming from more of a skeptical background, John being a Catholic from birth who seemed to dip his toe into agnosticism at some point, and Eric, former evangelical who found his way into the Catholic Church. I'm actually going to alleviate myself of the hosting duties here quick because John did such a good job last time of organizing the conversation. But it's good to have you all back on. It's nice to see your faces again, and I'm looking forward to this.
It's great to be here, Pat, and Eric, good to see you again. So yeah, this is going to be part 2. We're looking at like 3 fundamental questions: why believe God exists, why follow Jesus, we'll talk about the resurrection, why belong to the Catholic Church, because I think if you can answer affirmatively, with good reasons to those 3 questions, then you should be a Catholic Christian, or at least you have strong considerations to seek that out as a real possibility for your life. So this is going to be part 2, looking at those different evidences. And then in part 3, we're going to be dealing, and we'll hit some objections along the way today, but part 3 I thought would be great. Eric, you had a conversation on your podcast with an agnostic, and I thought it got into some really interesting issues about the problem of pain, problem of evil, and some other things. So we'll kind of go to that. Yeah. But do you want to give a little background so the listeners know what the heck I'm talking about there?
Yeah, well, it's actually one of my friends, Brian, and interestingly enough, he used to kind of be agnostic, I guess, growing up. He didn't grow up religious, but then he actually became Christian in college. And not only a Christian, but he became like an apologist, like a Christian. He was really into Christian apologetics. But he had some lingering doubts after like college and stuff that he finally gave full vent to. And one of those doubts was, doubting the existence of God because of the presence of animal suffering. And so in that podcast I did with Brian, we talk about that. But I think he comes from a unique standpoint because he used to be Christian. And, and I pray for him. I pray that he would come back to the faith and all of that. And he used to be a Protestant Christian. So he actually did go to Mass with me one time, which was really cool, and he actually enjoyed it. So, with all of us, like we're on the journey, right? And so if we can hopefully answer his questions better, and I did my best on the podcast I did, but I'm excited to get y'all two involved as well. And I know Pat's already written some stuff for Brian to look at as well. So it's really cool to see us coming together and really trying to help a brother out.
Yeah, no, I think it's great, and I think he's a very thoughtful, from what I could tell, a very thoughtful person, and is really considering things from an intellectual perspective and going to it. I am curious, when you took him to Mass the one time, was it like the Archbishop's appeal? Because that's what like the story is. You bring someone, and then it's like the most boring, dry, asking for money type of service. But
I'm pretty sure it was about celibacy. No, just kidding.
Okay. Yeah.
Worse. No, I don't even remember what it was about, but he loved, like, we sang the Our Father, and he really liked that. He just liked the being in that group, and also just the reverence of the Catholic Church and the holiness of the church that we were in. Really was beautiful to him, even though he was like, yeah, I still don't believe in God, but that was beautiful.
And I think it's important. And what I appreciate about that conversation, Eric, is I think back to my time, before I was a Christian and even before I was Catholic, is it's important that we take concerns and questions and objections seriously. And I think this might have been your point in the last conversation, John, of, one thing that you would recommend or lead people with is that, even though, and my friend, Dr. Josh Rasmussen makes this point, and he used to be an agnostic too. He says, even though that he thinks he can see very clearly God's existence through the light of reason, he doesn't think that somebody is irrational if they don't see the same things clearly, because he used to be in that position as well. And same thing, I think back to when I was skeptical and, I would have considered myself an atheist. I don't think I was irrational, at least I hope not, but I don't see myself as that way. I see myself as somebody who was, there was a lot of different influences and causes for my skepticism, but I was somebody who I think was sincerely trying to seek truth, as all of us are. There were just some things that weren't, that I wasn't aware of, right? And that a lot of error, I think, can come from just not being exposed to different pieces of evidence, arguments, traditions. So I think, the spirit of charity always should prevail, and that we should, no matter if it's an objection we've heard a million times, right? And that is the problem of evil, right? The problem of evil is the perennial objection, and sometimes it gets moved around a lot. Like, somebody might say, well, why do I have bad knees? Or, why did my wife die? Or why do animals suffer? It's all the same problem, but sometimes it affects people in different specific ways. And we always have to take these objections seriously, because this is a person we're dealing with, and this is a serious struggle. And I think and I'll just offer a personal note, Eric and I just did an episode on suffering before, right? Even after I think we clear the logical objections to the problem of evil, right? There's always that emotional problem of evil and pain as well. And that, of course, requires an entirely different approach. You might need to stop, going to the philosopher and start seeking a pastor or a counselor or something else there. So just a few thoughts, but I just want to say that I do appreciate that conversation you had, Eric. And I think it's just so important that we are patient and that we do treat these, any hesitations or objections seriously.
Very good. No, I think that's an important note. Good conversation. And again, in part 3, we're going to get into the weeds and the details of Brian's objections. But for today, let's lay our case on the table, or at least a good chunk of it. What is the evidence for the Catholic Christian worldview? Why should someone, be a Catholic? Maybe they weren't raised that way. Maybe they, maybe they were Catholic and then fell away because they thought it was just blind faith. So we're going to look at those 3 questions. Why believe God exists? Pat, you're going to take us through that. I'm going to talk a little bit about, why follow Jesus, a little bit about the resurrection. And we'll kind of mix and match if you want to add things to each other's points. And then Eric, you're going to take the lead on the Catholic Church. So without further ado, we will send it over to Mr. Pat Flynn. Why believe in God?
Right, because I think there's good reasons to. Now, actually, John, I was going to maybe kick it back over to you really quickly, just as a reminder, and I think this is important. We finished the last episode with this, is that keeping Pascal's wager in the background. So if you wouldn't mind,
sure.
Maybe just restate that briefly before we get into this, because I think it just helps to lower unnecessary barriers to entry. And I think that that's a really important theme before we start diving into these arguments and offering.
Absolutely. So I think, I like it's a good framework, a framework assumption, or not assumption, but framework idea to get on the table before you get into this, because actually Fazer has a great quote from Hilary Putnam, a philosopher that he always uses, about how, people know exactly what rational persuasive argument is supposed to be. Everybody knows what it is. Oh, you got rational arguments over here, until they get into conversations about God's existence. And then they just ratchet up the skepticism super high. He's like, a rational argument is supposed to be something that when you present the premises, anyone who is, rationally minded and thinking about truth should immediately assent to their conclusion. And that's what it is. And then he makes the point when he quotes Putnam on this much more eloquently. But then again, if you consider that the staple of rationality, then no one has rational arguments for any position, because there's no position out there. There's philosophers, professionals who doubt whether anything is conscious. There's experts out there who don't even think consciousness exists.
They doubt their own existence.
They doubt their own existence. So if you make the standard that any reasonable person upon seeing these premises will immediately assent to the conclusion, well, that's just not a reasonable standard. And if for some reason people only tend to bring those standards into these discussions surrounding religion. So that's kind of a bias we want to clear away. One of the ways of clearing it away is to consider Pascal's wager, which says, well, the version Dr. Michael Rhoda defends is that, if you can get the chances of Christianity being true, or say Catholicism, to around 50-50 for yourself. Maybe you're not 100% convinced. Maybe you see that there's real good evidence here, like we're about to present, but you're still in that middle zone of, I don't know. The rational thing to do would be to commit to a life of religious seeking or a religious life. That doesn't mean you have to tell yourself that you're believing a lie. You don't have to force yourself to believe something that's not true. That's not what Rhoda is saying when he presents the wager. He's saying just commit to religious seeking. And that can involve prayer, attendance of religious services. The prayer can be conditional. God, if you're real, help me to understand what you'd like me to do. Help me to know your plan for my life. Help me to see how I can help others out. Help me with this sin. Help forgive my sins. All that kind of stuff can be conditional in nature. And what he really does a nice job of is showing that because there's so much to gain in loving and knowing God and enjoying communion with him eternally, that even if you can get that evidence around to that middle level, you really should seek. And Jesus says, those who seek, shall find. So I think we have good scriptural warrant for encouraging others. Say the people just assume it's either 100% or nothing. Unless I am absolutely certain, convinced with like all of the, mathematical certitude of a proof that, 2 + 2 = 4, unless I get there, I can't commit to any religious ideas or any religious life. And I just want to challenge that assumption and say, no, that's not the way it should go. You can commit, and upon committing, you might find even more reasons to believe in God. You might develop what you come to see as like a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. If it, that might sound evangelical, but hey, Catholics, we believe that too. And there's a lot more that can happen there when you take that step. So keep that in the background. Things don't need to be super high. But with that said, I'm going to kick it over to Pat Flynn. What are some good reasons to believe in God?
Right. So last episode, I listed out the sort of the collection of a sketch of the different arguments that I think are pieces of evidence that point strongly in favor of theism. So let me just give a very brief, for once I'll actually not ramble for too long, for once and only possibly once. I think a general argument from contingency. Yeah, we're having one of those mornings where it's just, sentences just are not coming together. But I'm going to do my best here. And I've recently been spending a lot of time in the argument of contingency. I sent you both a little ebook I've been working on that is pretty thick and dense. But I want to give just a portion of this argument that I think is very plausible, very intuitive, and you can get it across quickly. Now, for people who are unfamiliar with the argument from contingency, essentially what we're trying to establish is a perfect foundation to reality. That's what we're after, right? So we look at reality as a whole. We realize this sort of paradox within reality. And the paradox would be something like this, right? There are certain things that exist, but they are dependent in their existence. They are caused realities, or they are conditioned realities. So for example, I am a conditioned reality. The reason I exist is because certain conditions external to me were fulfilled, which not only brought me into existence, but keep me in existence. Obvious ones would be my parents meeting and procreating, and not everybody likes to think about that, but it's true. And but there's also I'm contingent or dependent on sort of a cobweb, right, of different conditions being fulfilled here and now in order for me to exist. So if somebody were to just explode the earth, I would immediately be eradicated along with it. Or if somebody were to just mess around or, with electromagnetism or the strong nuclear force, goodbye, Pat Flynn, right? So I am radically contingent, or I am a conditioned reality. I am a caused reality, not just in the past, but for every moment that I exist. So caused realities definitely exist, right? We cannot escape this fact of experience. And then that's all we need to kind of get the argument off and running, because then we can sort of run this interesting paradox, and we could ask, could all of reality, the totality of everything real, whatever that is, we don't have to know everything that is, because the thought experiment will be enough to get this argument going, because we can conceive of the sort of totality of reality, everything that exists or once existed, whatever that is, could all of that be collectively a conditioned reality? And the answer here seems emphatically and certainly not. And we can know this, we can really know this, because we know that any conditioned reality exists only because of the fulfillment of certain conditions beyond itself. But if all of reality were a conditioned reality, even just collectively, then all of reality would be awaiting its existence on conditions beyond itself being fulfilled. But there's nothing beyond all of reality. It's literally the unreal, all of reality. That's it. There's nothing beyond it. So there would be no way to fulfill such conditions to bring all of reality into existence. So what we're saying here is that if all of reality were collectively a caused reality or conditioned reality or contingent reality, then nothing would exist. That's the paradox. We would be committed to the absurdity that nothing would have ever been brought into existence. Nothing could exist here and now. And there's only one way to resolve this. And the only way to resolve this is to come to the conclusion that there has to be one, and perhaps only one, reality that is uncaused, that is unconditioned, that stands independently, that doesn't just have existence, but is existence. That there's, as Dr. Josh Rasmussen likes to put it, there's a foundation to reality, some basement to reality that exists in virtue of what it is, that's not contingent, but a necessary reality. So that's the first step of the contingency argument. And that itself is an extremely powerful move for people. I think when people realize that, the sort of natural intuition from there is to say, oh, that must be God. Now, we haven't gotten to that yet, but that alone, I think, can provide a powerful step for people in the right direction. So why don't I pause right there? There's a second part of this argument where we can unpack the divine attributes and show, yes, this thing actually is the God of classical theism. But why don't I let you guys hop in with any comments or comment objections you think that you typically hear from that first part?
Well, okay, so I don't know if this is a common objection you hear, Pat, but I think I mentioned this to you before, but what if, like, within reality you have, let's say, three things that, like, this thing over here can exist, but it is contingent on this thing over here, and this thing over here is contingent on this thing, but they all complement each other to where it is, like, always existing. Or, like,
right.
How
so
do you deal with that?
Yeah, so that's called circular causation, right? And that's not going to work for a couple reasons. But to understand why circular causation won't work, we should first understand why an infinite regress won't work, because it's actually kind of the same thing. So this is really the most common, and I think probably the most powerful objection to this argument is, well, why couldn't there just be, turtles all the way down? Why couldn't there just be an infinite regress of contingent things, each one dependent on the other, and so on ad infinitum? Why does the metaphysical buck have to stop? And the metaphysical buck has to stop simply because if there were an infinite regress, we would never have the ultimate fulfillment of conditions to bring that entire series into existence to begin with. So let me try and build that out a little bit, right? So if A depends on B, and B depends on C, and C depends on D, et cetera, ad infinitum, well, then A is always awaiting existence on the ultimate fulfillment of conditions that is always one plus more set of conditions out that could ever be achieved, right? That's what the infinite means. It's literally the unachievable. So it's being infinitely deferred from ever coming to exist in the first place. So in this type of causal series, an infinite regress just makes it impossible that anything would have ever come to exist. We'd still be committed to the absurdity that nothing exists. Now, here's the important part. It doesn't matter how you arrange that. You can arrange it linearly. You can try and put it into a circle. You can try and make it into layered matrices. You're still going to wind up with the same absurd result, that without some type of necessary reality, either within that series or standing apart from that series, nothing would exist. So even in the circle A, B, C, there's either a terminating condition or there's not. If there's a terminating condition, that terminating condition must be the unconditioned necessary reality. If there isn't, then we're just passing the metaphysical buck in which nothing has ever come to exist in the first place.
No, I think that's an important response, and those are going to be, two of the major objections that get brought up is, why not an infinite regress, or why not the circular causation or mutual causation, A, B, A, B, A, B. And I think people also, now does time, let me just say one more thing, Pat, see if you can answer this before we go on to, like, stage two. Does time, are you thinking about time here? Because some people get bogged down. They're like, well, wait a minute. I can kind of just picture, I don't know, that ABC circular causation, but what if it was, like, infinitely old or eternal? Then, like, maybe it would work. Is your argument depending on time so far?
And this is a confusion, right? Eternality does not mean necessity. Right. So we can imagine that God, so just let's grant God for the sake of this thought experiment, that God exists necessarily, right? But he could, from all eternity, will the creation of contingent things. So we could have things that depend on this necessary reality for their existence, but have always been there, right? So there is a clear distinction to be drawn between necessity and eternality. And some things can, and Aquinas draws this distinction very helpfully, is that there could be necessary things, but they're necessary through another. They don't have existence in virtue of what they are, but they could, for so long as God has willed them from all eternity, they could have eternal existence, but not necessary existence. So it's wholly independent of how long something has existed, even if something has always been there, right? So this was Aquinas' original argument, because he would grant the sort of Aristotelian assumptions that the universe was past eternal, that it had no temporal beginning. He said, look, even if that's the case, we can still show that the universe has a cause and is contingent or dependent on a fundamentally necessary reality that just is existence as such, the full plenitude of existence for its being sustained in existence here and now. Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. So what right now, though, and just so the listeners are clear, he's not claiming at this point of the argument that automatically that has to be God, but just stage one, we've reached a metaphysically necessary foundation or an independent foundation of all reality. Is that right, Pat?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I just want to say,
yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Well, I just want to say, like, for the listeners out there, like, this is hard to think about for me. Like, I kind of need to sit with this for a while and, like, really think, because, I mean, it's hard to think about infinite regressions, right? Mm-hmm. Or like, so I do appreciate the arguments and all of that, but it is hard. It still doesn't make it, like, I still need more time to think about it, honestly.
Sure. And I think, go ahead.
So one thing that can be helpful is, like, just take a term that would apply to the infinite. And a good term that applies to the infinite is the unachievable, right? That there's always one plus more move that we could make. Right. And then just apply that to the idea of a causal series where something is dependent in its existence for the achievement of some fulfillment of conditions. And then we can just see. So really what the contradiction we're drawing out in an infinite regress of a causal series of this nature, we call this a hierarchical causal series, is we're drawing out the contradiction that we have somehow accomplished. We have somehow achieved the unachievable. That's the contradiction that's really being drawn out. Okay. And once we can see that, which it's conceptually difficult, right? We're doing a lot of abstract thinking here, but that's what's being demonstrated, is that there's a contradiction in applying an infinite regress to this type of causal series where we'd be positing that we've achieved the unachievable.
And some people complain when we draw analogies and illustrations. So Pat's kept it very conceptual, very abstract, and very correct so far. But some people do point to, because it is hard, the infinity thing, they'll point to, like, the stock examples are like, you had a chandelier hanging from a chain, and if those chain links represent caused realities, then, or conditioned realities and so forth, then, okay, you have 10 chain links, but if it's just suspended in midair, that chandelier is not going to be held up. You have 100 chain links, you have 1,000 chain links. No matter how many chain links you keep stacking upwards, if it's just suspended in midair, that chandelier can't be held up. And even if you posit an unending chain link thing that goes up into the air and is like, it's not attached to anything, but it's unending, it's unlimited, it's infinite in some sense. Even if you posit that, it doesn't make sense that the chandelier would be held up unless it's fastened into something secure. And that's like an analogy for what would be the metaphysically necessary reality. Sometimes that can help is looking at an illustration.
And like in the series of A, B, C, D, if A was actually the foundation, like if it wasn't contingent, then it could work, like
right
with the progression, I guess. But we're saying that A is a contingent thing, in which case that's impossible.
Right. I think now there could this would depend on how much force you think like certain other paradoxes have. But at least Aquinas would grant that you could have an infinite series of things that exists, but you would still need that necessary reality standing outside or a part of that series to bring that infinite series into existence, right?
Okay.
So the infinite series itself could never stand independently of a necessary reality or foundation. Mm-hmm. Now, there's other paradoxes that have been thrown out to say that maybe that even couldn't be the case, but we could grant it for the sake of this.
Sure.
Argument. Mm-hmm.
No, and I think those really are the objections that we've dealt with so far. Those are the big ones that come up at stage one. But then what everyone has in mind is, okay, well, but why think that's God? And that kind of gets us into what's been called stage two. So why don't we turn it back over to you, Pat? Give us like a few summary points or however much detail you got on this metaphysically necessary foundation. Why call that God?
So there's a long path and a short path. I'm going to pivot. I'm going to take the short path, and arguably the short path could bypass everything that we've just talked about. But I think it's interesting to do that first step, anyways, just because it's like a radical conclusion, right? But it's a conclusion that's very cool and that we could be certain of. And then in sort of more of my written work, I like to kind of take my time a little bit more and go through the essence and existence distinctions that Aquinas brings out. I think that's the most powerful way to understand why something is contingent. But a quicker way, and I think a very defensible way, is just to start with some type of causal principle or explanatory principle. And we have to be careful here, because if it's too broad, if it's too encompassing, we're going to run into the problem that we just ran into, right? If we say that, for example, that everything has a cause, well, that can't be true because of everything that we just said, right? That if everything has a cause, then all of reality would be depending on the unreal to bring it into existence, and out of nothing, nothing comes. So our explanatory principle can't be that broad, right? Or else we've got issues. Here's what I would suggest as an explanatory principle. I call this the sort of modest principle of sufficient reason. And this is very much in line with a Thomistic principle of sufficient reason, where we would say that every finite limited being has a sufficient explanation for its existence. So let me just give a few quick definitions here. When I talk about a finite limited being, I'm talking about any existing thing which is really more questionable than answerable. Anything which exists but, say, only this much, or only to this degree, or only in this way, or only here versus there, or only at this time versus that time, right? So in short, a finite limited being is any existing thing that cannot be sufficiently explained by reference only to itself. Right. And it has restricted intelligibility. At some point, you can always ask another why, like, why does this thing exist? Or why is it here versus there? Or why does it occur this frequently versus that? And we would have to go beyond it for that explanation in order to satisfy this causal principle. So what I'm arguing really is there's something about the very nature of a restricted essence or a set of limits on being that inherently points to an explanation beyond itself. Now, let me just give 3 quick reasons why I think we should believe this explanatory principle. And the first one is that it's just common sense, right? So science and philosophy depend on something like this principle, at least implicitly, because science and philosophy are on the hunt for explanations for all finite contingent things. We could also just call this natural things, and I know Dr. Robert Koons prefers that example. So if you were to deny this principle, you'd really just undercut all of science and philosophy right there. So maybe we only think that humans being finite and contingent things, limited things, evolved from lower life forms. But maybe it's just the case that we're just a brute fact. We just popped into existence or just kind of walked out of a swamp one day randomly. And nobody would take that seriously, right? Because we believe that given that we are finite, limited beings, there's some sufficient explanation for us. So science and philosophy are committed to this principle. So if you're committed to science and philosophy, you're going to want to affirm something like this. Otherwise, we're just going to ruin the entire rational enterprise. Furthermore, this principle is about as empirically supported as anything can get, because as it happens, when we hunt down explanations for finite, limited things, we typically find them. This is why science has been so enormously successful and so fruitful in its predictions, is that we can find causal explanations. Furthermore, when we don't find an explanation, say we walk into a room and there's a dead body there, and it seems like it's a murder scene, but we don't know who the murderer is, the last thing we say is, oh, no need to worry about that because obviously Pat's explanatory principle was false. No, we would say somebody killed this person, but we just don't seem to have enough evidence to know who it was, right? So even when the explanation isn't always available, that doesn't undermine the principle. In fact, the principle is what supports our continued hunt for the explanations to find evidence, because we know, right, deeply that there's a reason for this, right? But we can go even further. And as various philosophers like Dr. Koons have proposed, that if you try to even deny this principle, it's going to land you into a radical and global skepticism. So if you're going to deny that any sort of finite, limited thing can be explained by something sufficient beyond itself, well, then there's a possibility here, and it doesn't seem like it would be improbable, because there'd be no way to ground probabilities if we deny this principle, that maybe all of our thoughts, all of our cognitive states, all of our beliefs are just things that just happen to exist without any explanation, without any reasons for belief, without any causes for them. So there's sort of an epistemological self-defeat if you try and deny this principle that would land you in a global skepticism. And then you would have no reasons to trust any of your beliefs, But if one of your beliefs is to deny this modest principle of sufficient reason, you would no longer have any reason to deny this modest principle of sufficient reason. So it seems like you really can't escape it, that this principle may very well be known a priori. And if that's the case, the next move is pretty simple, right? If the nature of limits point to explanations beyond themselves, eventually we're going to have to explain all limits, right? Limits are just by definition a limit. So we're going to have to explain all limits. But we can't explain X in terms of X. That would be circular. So in order to explain the existence of any and all limited finite beings, we have to get to at least one unlimited and qualitatively infinite being as the source and foundation for why any finite limited being exists. And then when we unpack that, when we sort of explode limits and peel away limits, we get to a being that is, when I say qualitatively unlimited, it means there's no restrictions on what this being can do, what it knows, how valuable it is, etc. So it automatically sort of unfolds these omni attributes that we attribute to classical theism, right? Omnipotence.
If I could cut in for a second, Pat, because I want to, can you clarify that too? Because some people are like, wait a minute, 5 minutes ago you said no infinite regresses, and then all of a sudden you're saying this thing is infinite. But I know you mean it in different senses. Some people are like, well, wait a minute, how do you know it's not just, well, how can it be infinite if you just said nothing infinite is allowed, so forth?
Right. So we have to be, this is why philosophy is so big on clarification of terms. That's why I say qualitatively infinite. So we don't mean like an infinite spatial magnitude or a quantitative infinite, on and on and on. What we mean by qualitatively infinite, the better way to think about it is it's unbounded, unrestricted, right? Unlimited. So it's a different category, what we're talking about here. So that is an important distinction, John. I appreciate that. And then once you understand the idea of unrestrictedness, or that and this is where the Thomistic metaphysics is actually very helpful, but we don't have time to unpack it all. But when we understand the essence of something as being a sort of limiter, right, on being, or a modulator of being, we eventually have to get back to that whose essence just is existence. The fullness of existence is such that can then determine or select how any finite, limited mode of being can participate in the full and perfect plenitude that is God's existence as well. And then that's sort of the quick and easy way. Obviously, more work can be done to unpack the divine attributes, but I think it's a pretty intuitive step there to see, okay, well, once we kind of break free of limits, the divine attributes follow. Certainly omnipotence follows.
What are some of the attributes? Yeah, what are some of the particular attributes that would follow from like just this unlimited idea?
Power is the easy one, right? So obviously this thing has some power, right? It produced at least this universe, right? So what's the best and simplest explanation for how much power it has? Well, if we're getting rid of limits, there can be no arbitrary limits on its power. So it has unlimited power. Right? It has the power to bring about any and all possibilities of being, anything that isn't a contradiction, right? And then we can actually get from power, there's different ways you can get to omniscience, but you can get to omniscience from power, because you can say that to know is a power, right? The power to know things. So are there any limits on this thing's power to know? No. Okay. It's omniscient, right? And so on and so forth. And then if we understand that there's no limits on being, and then if we understand that goodness and being are convertible, and this will probably take us too far afield, but I'll just give the general sketch, right? There's no privations in this. There's nothing missing, right? There's no further ends for this being to attain. Then it's as good as it gets, we can say, right? That Jack Nicholson movie, as good as it gets, right? It's perfectly good. There's no lacks, wrinkles, defects, or all. So right there, you have the classic, I think, 3 omni attributes of God from this type of argument. Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, no, I think it's a nice look at the argument. And so stage 1, we got to a metaphysically independent or metaphysically necessary foundation, and then stage 2, you took us through that modest principle of sufficient reason, which leads us to the ground of reality being unlimited, having the fullness of existence, and then you kind of pointed to how it will be all-knowing, perfect. And also, you can get to all goodness as well, right? Like that, again, this will take some more metaphysical work, but I think when you have that much, I think you can at least say the best explanation of the idea that we have all of that. If you're not willing to go to deductive certainty, I think the best explanation is, well, hey, or one explanation, the God of classical theism exists.
Right. And I think you can get to deductive certainty. And I think that this is kind of an epistemological approach. So you can take a more deductive approach through act potency, essence existence, which is, I think, even more rigorous, but it would take far longer. I'm trying to find that balance here in the conversation of, right, let's be concise but still forceful, which is always kind of it's a balancing act, right? But there's other things that we can do just very quickly, and I want you guys to chime in, is like we can just look at categories on hand, right? So there are minds in this world. Does it make a better explanation, or does it seem like a better explanation to have mind at the foundation like we would with God that could produce other minds? Or does it seem like some type of dumb physical simple is a better explanation? And it seems obvious that having mind at the foundation is better. Otherwise, we face a qualitative abyss that I don't think can ever be coherently traversed, right? How you get consciousness from unconsciousness, intention, and directedness from things that are completely without intention or direction. That's like trying to get, a purple tower from only white Lego blocks. There's a qualitative category that's completely missing. That doesn't matter how many quantitative parts you have. It doesn't matter how you arrange those parts. You're never going to traverse that abyss. So there's other pieces of evidence that we can add that I think just only adds further force to the argument.
No, I think that's good. I think at this point, and I would almost do what Eric did in the conversation you were having. So, because people are like, okay, maybe there's this, uncaused, super awesome reality, but that gives me nothing to go to Christianity. And I love what you did, Eric. You kind of just asked a question that everyone has to consider. Well, okay, what do you do with the person of Jesus? And I think that's something like, have you found that helpful, like in evangelization, just to ask people, like, that's a great starter. Like, what do you think of Jesus?
Like, yeah, exactly. I mean, and the verse that I keep thinking about right now, just to share this with y'all as well, is it says in Psalms that a fool says in his heart, there is no God. So I often find, like, in a lot of these conversations I do have with atheists or agnostics, that it's really a heart issue. I think there are some intellectual issues as well, like, and that's what I love about these arguments, and that you can put these forward. But you always have to keep in mind, like, usually people are atheists because of something else happening in their life. And so also we have to understand that conversion is a spiritual thing. Like, it's like, it takes a lot of prayer. And so, yes, we need to have these reasons and also faith. But I think that question of who is Jesus is so important, because in our beliefs, in our faith, we believe Jesus is God. So God became man and dwelt among us, which is why I pointed out last time in our conversation, like, how crazy it is that people can doubt God's existence when God became man and dwelt among us. And of course, like, when Jesus walked on the earth, you wouldn't have been able to take a microscope and analyze his, like, person and be like, oh yeah, he's God because we did this test result. So obviously science has limits, and this is a thing of faith, but we were mentioning motives of credibility last time, which I think is a great way of putting it, of like, well, there's fulfilled prophecies, there's the miracles that he did. And so, I mean, I'm obviously you're going to go into this, John, but yeah, who is Jesus? Like, everyone, you can't not deal with that question, because even secular historians know that this Jesus of Nazareth existed and was crucified.
Yeah. I just want to add one more thing, because that's a really good point. Is I've gotten to a lot of conversations with people, and that's exactly what they'll say. John will say, okay, like that kind of makes sense, but that doesn't prove that Christianity or Catholicism is true. And I'll be like, righto, dude, righto. It does not. It absolutely does not. But we've made significant progress, right? And that should, and we should
anymore.
Yeah. Like, it shows that atheism is false. So, and that's a huge step. Like, we can all do a round of high fives of that. But I would, push it a little bit further and say, let's also recognize what this argument and arguments like this do, because this isn't the only one, right? And this isn't the only way to stage this argument either. Is that it actually really narrows down the theological hunt of possibly true religions, right? Because we get to a God of classical theism. Okay, well, what's eliminated from these arguments? Well, what's eliminated would be polytheism. That's not a tenable option anymore. Or if there are a pantheon of gods, they're still contingent upon the absolute, right? So some type of moral monotheism is true. Pantheism is out. Whatever God is, he's radically transcendent of the universe. So God just isn't the universe, right? The universe,
not the force.
It's not the force, right?
Yeah.
There's intelligence in this being, right? So it's not an impersonal. So we're really kind of down to the possibly true religions being the great monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and maybe arguably some forms of Hinduism, right? And that's a huge step. Like that's a significant step. And then we can start to ask this question, okay, well, every religion has an opinion on Jesus, right? Every single one. Islam has an opinion, Judaism has an opinion, Christianity obviously has one, Buddhism, Hindu. So who's got the right one? That's the question. Because in that sense, like, everybody's got a claim about who Jesus was. So according to the evidence, who's got the right one? And I think that's a good way to proceed from there. So John?
Yeah, so let's get into that. And let me just make a couple comments, though, too, on what you guys said, because, Eric, I think you bring up a good point, but some people might take it the wrong way. When you quote that psalm, the fool says in his heart that there is no God. I think a lot of, atheists they could do two things. One, they could throw that back on us and say, well, hey, you only believe in God because it's wishful thinking, and like only gullible people believe in wishful thinking. Or two, they'd be like, well, this psalmist is ridiculous. Is he really saying that like everyone who ever lived, that ever uttered, there is no God, is therefore a fool? And I actually don't think that's what the psalmist is saying in context. And you can kind of think about this. Well, first of all, you got to go back to Judaism. You got to go back to the Old Testament, perhaps. And I forget, you can look at it, but anyway, this is like people who are living in a culture where God dwelt among them, brought them out of slavery in Egypt, like did all of this stuff. And perhaps it could be targeted at an individual who, despite all of those profound motives of credibility and what God has done, still like just willfully rejects him. It doesn't necessarily apply to everyone who's ever uttered the sentence, God does not exist. So I think that's important to get on the table.
Yeah, that's good.
And an example that Dr. Rasmussen gave when he was on my show, he's like, well, consider the sentence like, the libertarian says in his heart that we should reduce the size of government. It doesn't follow from that everyone who says we should reduce the size of government is a libertarian, right? Like it only follows like, in some cases that's the case. So some people, but then again, you're absolutely right that some people should be convicted by this. Maybe they just refuse to look into the evidence. They refuse to follow it because of a circumstance or attachment to something negative in their life. And so it absolutely can convict some people. I just don't want people to take it the wrong way and think it must necessarily convict.
And people are complicated, right? We're not just intellectual beings. We're emotional. We have experiences. And so I think for a whole person to reject God, we have to encounter the whole person. We can't just encounter their intellect.
Exactly.
And I think that's why, just one quick thing, because I know we're on a time limit here, but that's why the nature of a good argument is to raise the intellectual price tag as high as it can possibly go, to the point where the price of escaping the argument is a price that hopefully nobody will want to pay, right? So even in these two stages of the argument that I gave, all right, you can try and duck out of the first stage by affirming the absurdity that nothing exists, but does anybody really want to? Is that how far you're willing to go? Or in trying to, with the epistemological defense of the modest PSR, you could dig your heels in and try and deny it, but you're probably going to land up in a really radical global self-defeating skepticism, right? And everything that most people want to affirm is going to come down with that: science, philosophy, etc. So people can always find a way out. The question is, what is the price that has to be paid for finding a way out? Mm-hmm.
All right, very good. Well, with that in mind, I think those are the good preliminaries to dive into the Jesus question a little bit. What I'll do is I'll kind of defer. I wanted to make my first point is just Jesus made radical claims about himself, and we kind of talked about that in part one. So I'll kind of refer people to that. And Eric, you gave some great examples. He really did make radical claims about himself. This is evident in the earliest sources. He came on the scene, an unquestionable authority. He commanded. He tried to he basically was editing the Torah as he was speaking. Like no one does this who just has human authority or claims to do this. So what are you going to do with this person who made these claims? Are you going to believe that those claims are correct? Or are you going to think he's a liar? Are you going to think he's crazy and so forth? And that kind of leads us, typically the next step that I found helpful is to look at some of his miracles, or in particular the resurrection. Because if he rose from the dead, then that would seem to vindicate his radical claims about himself and show that he was truly the Son of Man, truly the Son of God, deserves worship, ought to be followed, and all that stuff. So the next question to kind of think about, if you want to just focus on one motive of credibility, there are others. There's prophecies, there's the church, which you're going to talk about, Eric. But examining this historically, do we have good grounds to think he rose from the dead? And what I like is kind of a mix of things. I have to admit, this is not my area of expertise, but I love pointing at people, and I'll point to some good folks. I think 4 facts are pretty, a good way to go is with establishing 4 facts historically and then asking what best explains those facts. And in the course of establishing those facts, you're also going to talk about the reliability of the sources. Now, the historical reliability of the sources, people are doing, great work on this. Pat, you've talked to the McGrews. Tim and Lydia McGrew have great stuff on historical reliability. Brant Petrie, in a Catholic context, has great stuff on historical reliability. But and the Lacona points out in particular, historical reliability does not mean absolute unassailability. That, like, we don't need to assume at the outset that these documents are sacred scripture, inspired, perfect, cannot be wrong in any jot or tittle. We may come to believe that by faith. And personally, I do. I hold to a full doctrine of inerrancy of sacred scripture. But in the argument of proposing that Jesus rose from the dead, we don't have to assume that. So before I get to the facts, let me state the 4 facts, and then I'll give a little bit of historical reliability, and then we'll talk about explanations. But the 4 facts I think that are pretty good, and again, this is following Dr. Craig, other people, Lacona. I think death by crucifixion is really strong. You have both internal and external sources claiming that Jesus died by crucifixion in the first century at the hands of Pontius Pilate. That's a really strong fact. Second, I would point to the empty tomb, and I'll give some support of that the tomb was found empty. Third, that there were appearances. People had appearances of Jesus, that he was alive, and he appeared to them after his death. And then sometimes that can get overstated, and people will criticize that. But at the very least, the fact that some of those appearances occurred is very well attested and historically reliable. And then fourth, the origin of Christianity. The fact that it started in Judea, at a time when, people were Jewish and didn't expect or buy into any of this resurrection stuff. It was able to start small and explode very, very quickly and spread throughout the world. And after you kind of establish those 4 facts, death by crucifixion, empty tomb, some postmortem appearances, and the radical spread and origin of Christianity, you got to ask, what best explains those facts? So I'll get to some explanations, but just briefly, what is the foundation? But how would you go about establishing those facts? Why think the New Testament documents are reliable? Again, I am not presupposing absolutely unassailable. I'm just saying they are historically reliable. They get stuff right about who Jesus was and what he did. And here are some reasons for that. First, Brant Petrie does a nice job of showing that there's good evidence that the traditional authorship of the Gospels is correct. And you got to be careful. Maybe I shouldn't lead with that point, because if you make that point to a university student who's only taken 1 class on this or something, they're going to say, all these scholars agree that the sources are completely anonymous and no one has any idea who wrote them. There's been a lot, particularly in the 19th and 20th century, that did get pretty widespread, that belief that these are anonymous, no one knows who wrote them. But Brant Petrie's gone back, he's looked at the evidence. Jimmy Akin does this too, in The Bible is a Catholic Book. And they've just said, well, hey, wait a minute, let's look at the internal and external evidence. When we look at the papyri, when we look at the earliest manuscripts, they do actually claim to be written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They say the gospel according to Matthew, the gospel according to Mark. It's attached to the top. Now, it's not in the text. So some people might mean anonymous in a thin sense, like it doesn't appear in the text, but they mean, and okay, we can grant that sense of anonymous. It doesn't say in verse 1, I, Matthew, wrote this, I, Mark, wrote this. No, but attached, literally on the physical documents that we find, the extant ones, it has the inscriptions of the gospel writer. So that's one. The external evidence too. If you look at the earliest sources who talk about it, you look at Papias, you can say, you look at Irenaeus and so forth, all the evidence is pointing in one direction. It doesn't point to other authors. It only points to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So that's pretty strong that there were some, that these were the actual men who wrote these documents. And since they were followers of Jesus, in particular, Matthew and John were apostles. They would have been following him the whole time. So we have good reason to believe that they're going to testify to the truth. Another way to, and you could argue about this a lot, and there's a lot of counters and counterpoints, but I'm giving a sketch here. Matthew and John, because they were Jewish and, intending this for a Jewish audience and so forth, and in particular Paul as well, they would not have taken lying very lightly. Like one of the commandments, don't bear false witness against your neighbor. Or even if you think these documents were assembled in a community of Jews, let's say, well, if they were actually Jewish, they're not just going to start spewing falsehoods in these texts that they wrote. So that's one thing to consider, that they wouldn't have just spewed falsehoods. They would have been a little bit accurate. Luke also claims to be a historian and use a lot of sources and so forth. And then another thing to consider too is with the fact that they were Jewish, so they wouldn't be prone to lying. But the other thing, and this comes out in another point, is lying didn't really get them any gain. So if they were just going to make up all these documents and lie about them only to be persecuted, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So those are some preliminary reasons. You could go into the McGrews in a lot of details, but I think the documents are pretty reliable, and the earliest ones do give us death by crucifixion, some postmortem appearances, and the origin of Christianity. Briefly on the empty tomb, because Lacona and Habermas actually don't list the empty tomb as a minimal fact, because their requirement for a minimal fact is that it's widely attested in the scholarly sources, like above like 90 or 95%. And the empty tomb, only like 75% of scholars attest to it. Nonetheless, I think there's good reasons to believe it. And Lacona gives a nice little acronym. He calls it JET, J-E-T. Some reasons to believe in the empty tomb. One, it started in Jerusalem. That's the JET. It took place in Jerusalem, and that's where Christianity started to spread out of Judea. It broke out there and spread there. And how could it have spread there well if they could have easily just pointed to the tomb and produced a body? It doesn't really seem like it would spread very well. Another piece of evidence in favor of the empty tomb is enemy attestation. The earliest Jewish sources that we have said like the disciples stole the body and other explanations, but they never say, oh, they just made up that the tomb was empty. They actually presuppose that the tomb was empty. And the third thing in JET, J-E-T, so Jerusalem, enemy attestation, and testimony of women is, T is testimony of women. And women's testimony was devalued in Jewish and Roman culture. And if you were inventing a story that you wanted people to believe, then you probably wouldn't have put women as the first people to find the empty tomb. So those are some strong reasons for reliability, empty tomb in particular. And once you have those facts on the table, you consider the hypotheses. And well, actually, I'll turn it over to you guys for a minute. What do you think are some of the hypotheses that people consider or other things? And then we'll talk about the resurrection.
Right. Excellent summary. And this was something that I have to say, like, blew my mind when I was first investigating Christianity. Not that there was, because I have to say my expectations were, I think I just assumed a lot of the kind of secular bias that there is like no evidence, right? So when I found that there was evidence and a considerable amount of it, like I was really taken aback by this. I was like, wow, I was severely wrong. And like you said, what's nice about this kind of minimal facts approach, right, is we can just lay out these facts at sort of the majority, and oftentimes the vast majority of historians and New Testament scholars agree upon, who span the entire spectrum of beliefs, right? Very conservative to very liberal, some religious, some not, right? They agree on these facts, and for good reason, like you pointed out, right? We have independent attestation, eyewitness testimony, undesigned coincidences and illusions, right? So it just meets all the criteria of historical credibility. And then, like, once that's on the ground, you get to what John's talking about here is, okay, these are the facts. We have good reason to believe that these facts actually occurred. What best explains them? And then it's just like, okay, can any naturalistic hypothesis, does it have adequate explanatory power, depth, all those things? And you asked for some that come to my mind. Of course, we've got conspiracy theories, right? Like you already hinted at, maybe somebody just stole the body. We've got hallucination theories that seem to be the most popular for a while, even though that's kind of fallen away. Like maybe these people just had these fantastic projections of their mind. My absolute favorite stupid hypothesis of all time is the Joe Rogan one, that maybe they just swallowed a bunch of mushrooms, right? It's like the spandrel thing, like, oh, okay, yeah. And it just makes you laugh, and we'll get into that. But I mean, I guess the whole mushroom hypothesis would kind of fall into the hallucination one in an even more bizarre way. Swoon theories, things like that, right?
Well, let me get to this real quick. Let me see if because I know we again can't get into all the details, but we'll refer you to the McGrews, to Petrie's work on all this stuff for detail. But briefly, let's see why those hypotheses maybe don't work as well. With the swoon theory, we could say that the Romans were really good at crucifixion. So they knew how to kill people very well and humiliate people. That was kind of the purpose of crucifixion. And secondly, if this swoon theory did occur, then Jesus wouldn't have like some, glorious return or appearance to folks. He would be like barely alive. And that's just not.
I'm sorry, John, not to interject, but we should have said what the swoon theory actually is.
Oh, yeah, good point. Yeah. Sorry. You know what? Sometimes we get into the terminology. The swoon theory is that Jesus just passed out on the cross, that he wasn't killed and was laid in the tomb and then later revived and then was fine.
Right. And so not killed, just had a really, really bad day.
Really bad day. And we're talking really bad.
And that assumes, right, that like the Gospel of John's not true, because the Gospel of John accounts that like the spear pierced his heart and blood and water gushed forth, which would obviously mean, and he was already dead when that happened. So this was just
right. Some of the medical people say, right, that's like proof of like they punctured the amniotic, not the amniotic. There's like a thing that they puncture,
right,
and that shows a certain type of death. This is actually in the movie The Case for Christ. I can't remember the name of it, but absolutely, Eric. So yeah, there is like medical evidence as well that points to the fact that he died. But my point is, even if he wasn't technically dead, the rest of the story doesn't make sense, because he would have been beaten to a pulp,
right?
Like, and he would have had to awake, and like still you would have had to like have him move away the stone, like walk around and like do all this stuff. And it just like people would have pointed this out, like this guy's like half dead.
Right. And nobody would be, inclined to heap worship on somebody in that miserable of a state, right? This would never have inspired the Easter worship of the earliest Christians.
Sure.
It's pretty laughable.
So that's the swoon theory. The conspiracy one that they made it up, I kind of already attested to that, but I think the good evidence against that is there's not really good motivation for the lie. That yes, people do die for things that turn out not to be true, like people talk about the 9/11 hijackers, but the fact that they die for their belief indicates that they have sincerity in holding it, and especially if they were eyewitnesses, and we have good evidence that at least Peter, James, and John were martyred for the faith. And people get a little extravagant and say like all the apostles except for John, which actually very well might be true, but the really strong historical evidence is for those three. That they
Can I just add one thing there, John? I think when it comes to people dying for their faith, I also want to highlight the way people die for their faith.
Mm.
So did the 9/11 terrorists, did they die saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do"? No. But Stephen did, the first martyr. Polycarp did. All like the martyrs died not only for their faith, but they die in a way that loves their enemies.
Mm.
That's huge.
And just, so the whole idea of that is we're not saying that because people die for their faith, it means that the faith is true. We're attesting to the sincerity of their beliefs. And people can still have sincere beliefs about false things, but this is part of the cumulative case to show, no, this belief actually is true, right? So just drawing those distinctions is important. Secondly, and I'm not sure if you mentioned this, I don't want to skip ahead in your notes here, John, is the conversion of skeptics as well, right? It wasn't just followers of Christ. And that, of course, is strong evidence against the conspiracy theory, is the conversion of skeptics.
In particular, Paul.
Right?
In particular, Paul and Habermas and Lacona do a great job of analyzing Paul. Like Paul was a Jew, he was not for this Christianity business at all. Like what explains his, radical conversion to the faith, and him, I think I might have misspoke before, but the three that we have really, really good evidence for is Peter, James, and Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Those three were martyred for the faith, like dying for the faith. And yeah, exactly like you're saying, Eric, like Paul was saying, he was like biggest commitment, like every act you do should be in love and faith and all that. Like it's very different from the 9/11 hijackers, but those three who died for the faith, and Paul in particular, who had the radical conversion. You could talk about James and, being the brother of the Lord. We can interpret that as Catholics too, but his conversion to seeing Jesus as the Messiah, all that's big. Conspiracy. So that's against conspiracy. Briefly, hallucination theory. Some points against it would be that hallucinations are private. They're not like public. You have a personal hallucination. So it's just kind of weird to say that like Peter, James, and Paul had independent personal hallucinations and that they all had these. It's just kind of implausible. Secondly, Paul does attest to like groups witnessing Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15. And it's really like group hallucinations are just not really a thing. And then the third thing I'll just say, and you can get into all the details, but grief-stricken hallucinations are a real thing. Like people grieve and they have a hallucination of someone who died. But the Jews at that time, the grief hallucinations wouldn't have meant for them that the person is bodily alive again. It might have just meant that they're alive in the afterlife or alive in heaven. And N.T. Wright does a lot of work on that. Their grief hallucination wouldn't have given rise to the belief that he was bodily resurrected from the dead. So with swoon theory, hoax, hallucinations gone, you can talk about myths and so forth.
Yeah, and one more thing about the hallucination is this: how this ties into the empty tomb, right? If it was mere hallucination, right? That might explain one thing. I don't think it really explains it at all, right? Because these appearances were over to multiple people, over multiple instances, multiple locations, right? And just you cannot stretch hallucinations to that extent to be able to explain that data. But then you could always just go back to the tomb and be like, oh, you're the guy's right here. He's dead, right? And no, it doesn't, right?
Right. So it doesn't explain that particular fact as well. So it doesn't have a wide enough scope. Long story short, you can go through a lot of different explanations and you got to weigh them. But I definitely think the best explanation is that Jesus rose again, as Dr. Craig likes to say, leaving an empty tomb behind him and therefore vindicating his radical claims. But I know I talked on that for a while, so I want to give you some time, Eric, because even all of that does not show that we should be Catholics necessarily.
Right.
Especially nowadays, there's a lot of different things to choose from. So, Eric, feel free to follow up with that, and then
how much time do we have, John?
Lead into the Catholicism stuff. Well, I'll say this too: even if I have to jump out in like the next 7 or 8 minutes, you guys can still finish it off.
Okay.
Cool. Well then, John, if we can do that, then I would like to spend at least a few more minutes on yours, because I think this is such an awesome step. Not too much time.
That sounds good. Yeah, because I have to hop out in about like 5 minutes.
Yeah. So rather than just kind of storm through here, just to spend a little bit more time on the resurrection account. The one thing I would add to this again is prior belief, prior worldview, and degree of expectation.
Oh, good point.
And right, so one of the main objections is kind of an a priori objection against miracles, because somebody's already assuming an atheism, right? They're already assuming that miracles are in principle impossible because God does not exist. Well, if we've already cleared that away, if God exists, miracles are clearly possible. And then if we also have a robust conception of God that has these omni attributes, especially omnibenevolence, might we expect something like the resurrection to occur? Might we expect that a God would want to not only enter into our suffering, enter into the depths of God-forsakenness, to be with us in our suffering and redeem us up to glory? Might that be something we can, even if we can't predict, can we make sense of? And the answer, I think, obviously is yes. It fits like a hand in a glove. And then like kind of flip that and ask, okay, if naturalism were true, like what is the chances that we would even have any like evidence at all that even makes something like this seem even a possibility? And it just seems so fantastically improbable on that worldview. So I guess the angle I'm pushing here is your prior belief and worldview will factor heavily into how you see this evidence. And if you already think that there's good reasons to be a theist, a classical theist, well, it's all converging, right? It all points in the same direction, and it really bolsters the account, where the evidence on the ground again, doesn't need to be as heavy because we already have a certain, say, degree of expectation. Now, I don't want to downplay the evidence, because I think in some cases the evidence could be so strong that it could actually flip somebody's worldview if you really push it. But if you already have the worldview, then this is just, again, it's like a hand in a glove. So I think that's just important to kind of keep that in mind.
Yeah, I was going to add, because the one thing we didn't consider is some people will just look at all the possibilities and say, well, look, I don't know what happened. And they'll put a kind of a Humean objection that it doesn't matter what happened, but a miracle can't be the most likely thing, because we have all this evidence of things behaving according to laws of nature only and not happening miraculously. So therefore, even if I can't pick an explanation that's the best and say mine's better than the resurrection, we kind of have an a priori Humean reason to just say, well, there was some natural explanation. I just can't explain it. And I want to just give a nod, Pat, to your show where you had Dr. Tim McGrew on, and you did like a whole refutation of that theory. But maybe you could just say a brief word or two in response to like that Hume objection.
Yeah, some people can just be really sophisticated in begging the question, is ultimately what the Humean objection comes down to, right? And, Dr. Tim points out, it's like, hey, if we're going to like have any idea of like what religion might possibly be true, it seems like we would need some sort of sign or divine endorsement. And that's where like a miracle makes sense. But a miracle can only stand out if there is a regular natural order of things, right? If there's a way that nature typically behaves. And we can only understand a miracle if we actually have some understanding of how nature typically behaves, right? That, virgins don't give birth, for example, and that dead people stay dead. So when you understand, I think, Hume's position at heart, and there's of course been more sophisticated contemporary, versions of this, but I think they all ultimately succumb to a similar response, is that it really begs the question against the possibility of miracles. And yeah, to save time, I'll just say 2 Philosophy Fridays ago, I had a very in-depth conversation with Dr. Tim on that for people who are interested.
Awesome.
Well,
go ahead.
There's a great series on YouTube called Lutheran Satire. And he was like arguing with like Richard Dawkins about this point or something. It was like it's a cartoon thing. It was like, yeah, miracles don't exist except for the one time that it actually happened. Yeah. So like,
well, it's funny because it's like there's also this like chronological condescension, right? It's like, oh, as Catholics, like you think that a virgin gave birth, and like, yeah, I do. But like, I think that's just as strange as you do, dude. Like that's like somebody wrote, like, it's not like I think that this happens all the time, or it's not like people back then weren't familiar with death, right? It's not like this is something that has come to light, in the age of modern science, that people just did it until the past 200 years. Nobody knew that dead people stayed dead. Like this is somehow, and you get this like sort of hand waving chronological condescension of this, and it's just like, and really, it's just a lot of begging the question. And at the end of the day, we have to get back to what is the evidence? What is the evidence, and what are the arguments? And just try and get past all that, obfuscatory chin pulling, I guess. Right?
I do have to hop out here, but I'll just leave you guys. Eric, I look forward to hearing your presentation on the podcast. But what I would say so far is we've talked about, we have good reason to believe that God exists, and we have some strong reason to follow Jesus. And next we're going to look to, but if that's the case, why belong to the Catholic Church? So I'm going to leave it to you guys. I got to skip out, but I look forward to talking to you again for part 3.
Rock and roll, John.
Awesome. Well,
all right, my man, Eric. And then there were 2.
Then there were 2. Wow. Yeah. And I mean, I know we've gone a while, but the cool thing about this show is that people could pause it, for each of the parts and just like, treat it as 3 different shows really. But
yep.
One of the big evidences actually Pope Benedict XVI points out as far as the truth of the resurrection. It's a really simple thing actually, but I think it's profound. In the Jewish culture, the Sabbath was everything, and the Sabbath was on Saturday. From the very earliest days of Christianity, like the start of Christianity, they started celebrating on Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why? It's because of the resurrection. Like, you don't just shift thousands and thousands of years of religious tradition rooted in your scriptures, rooted in what God has told you. You don't just change that flippantly.
Right, like
Saturday to Sunday. Like, that's a huge thing.
Yeah, and I mean, that's just such a good point, right? There's so much historical context that I think, since we're so detached from that time period, that we don't fully appreciate, which is why I've actually enjoyed studying the evidence for the resurrection so much, because it actually just taught me so much about the culture at the time that I was so unfamiliar with, but bears heavily into the understanding that's important, and even details like that might not seem, that we might totally miss at first, right? But then as we start to unpack a little bit, oh no, this is significant. Like, what would have caused such a significant shift? And obviously, the best and simplest explanation for all the data, all the facts that John put out, all the data that John put out, and that one would just be the traditional explanation that God really did raise Jesus bodily from the dead. It has perfect explanatory power, scope. It's not ad hoc. It's the traditional explanation, right? It's the one that people were giving, and it fundamentally transformed the world. So yeah, that's another good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and so in fact, this ties into evidence for the Catholic Church in particular, because I'm going to pull up Saint Justin Martyr. He's writing in around 155 AD. So just to give you all a reference, Jesus died around 33 AD. The the Gospel of John and the Book of Revelation were some of the later written things. So around 95 AD book of Revelation. And so not much longer, you have these early church fathers, right? And actually we have earlier sources. But St. Justin Martyr says this about why they celebrate on Sunday. He says, "We hold our common assembly on Sunday because it is the first day of the week, the day on which God put darkness and chaos to flight and created the world, and because on that same day our Savior Jesus Christ rose from the dead. For he was crucified on Friday, and on Sunday he appeared to his apostles and disciples and taught them the things that we have passed on for your consideration." And so from the very beginning, they're celebrating what's called the Lord's Day, which is Sunday, which is different than Saturday. And the reason why I bring St. Justin Martyr up is because this blew me away. So here's my main thing. I'll skip to my main thing real quick. I grew up as a Protestant, as an evangelical, and I really had a passion to be part of the early church. But it never really crossed my mind, like, other than the book of Acts, well, what is the early church like? Like, what do they do? What do they believe? It was just like, I believed that the scriptures had all the information. But if you look at the book of Acts, it just ends kind of abruptly in Acts 28 with Paul just preaching the gospel in Rome. Well, what happened after that? And it's actually funny. I was part of a Reformed Baptist movement that called themselves the Acts 29 Network. And I hope that the people in there really start considering, like, well, what was that next chapter that was written? And I would point to sources, and once again, this isn't the same as Scripture, because the Scripture is the Scripture. Like, that's the written, God-breathed Word of God. But these disciples, like, Jesus gave them a commission, right? In Matthew 28, he said, "Go therefore into all the world, making disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and lo, I am with you until the end of the age." Did the disciples do their job, or did they not? Did they actually make disciples, or did they not? They did, and we have their writings. So the Apostle John, he disciples a guy named Saint Ignatius of Antioch and a guy named Saint Polycarp, actually. And Saint Polycarp disciples a guy named Saint Irenaeus, and so forth and so on. We have this chain of discipleship. So they're passing on what they were taught from Jesus, and they're passing on to their disciples. And so we shouldn't limit what they pass on just to the writings of Scripture, because the Scriptures don't allow us to do that. The Gospel of John even says that if we were to record all of the things Jesus did and taught, we wouldn't fill up all the libraries in the world. And St. Paul even says in Thessalonians, you must hold on to not only what we've taught in word, but also the traditions. So when we say tradition, we mean that oral passing on of the gospel.
Right.
And so here's the big evidence for me is, like, I'm a 21st century American. How do I possibly know that I'm interpreting the scriptures correctly? How do I possibly know that I'm reading this right? You know, maybe I should go back to the earliest sources that we have and see what they said. And I think you'll be shocked to see that they're Catholic. So I'll actually begin with St. Justin Martyr, since I mentioned him, and then I'll go back in time to St. Ignatius of Antioch. So St. Justin Martyr, I was blown away when he describes, like, what Christians actually did. So first of all, in the book of Acts, it says this, and I actually was part of a church that their whole church was like, this was their foundational verse. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. And so as a small group in my Protestant church, we were like, okay, we need to read the scriptures. That's the apostles' teaching. We need to have fellowship. We need to break bread. We interpreted that just to mean, like, have a meal together. And we need to pray together. That's great, except that the early Christians interpreted breaking of bread to actually mean the Eucharist as well. And that was in the context of a meal, sure. It was in the context of what they call a love feast, but it was also different. It was something completely sacred and special. It was the fulfillment of John chapter 6, eating the flesh and drinking the blood of Christ to participate in the divine life of God. And so St. Justin Martyr, you know, we often ask, like, well, the Mass, you know, where did that come from? Like, why is there a liturgy of the word? Why are there prayers of the faithful? Why is the liturgy of the Eucharist there? Well, St. Justin Martyr is the first evidence we have of what Christians actually did when they came together to celebrate. So what did Acts 2:42 actually look like lived out? Well, St. Justin Martyr says this in around 155 AD. On Sunday, we have a common assembly of all our members, whether they live in the city or the outlying districts. The recollections of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as there is time. When the reader has finished, the presider of the assembly speaks to us. He urges everyone to imitate the examples of virtue we have heard from the readings. Then we all stand up together and pray. On the conclusion of our prayer, bread and wine and water are brought forward. The president offers prayers and gives thanks to the best of his ability, and the people give assent by saying Amen. The Eucharist is distributed. Everyone present communicates, and the deacons take it to those who are absent. So we have right there.
Sounds like a wonderful Catholic Mass. Yep.
It's a Catholic Mass. It's liturgy of the Word. We're hearing the Scriptures, the Apostles' teaching. We're having fellowship. We are praying together, the prayers of the faithful, and then we're doing the breaking of the bread, the Eucharist. And just to be clear about the Eucharist, St. Justin Martyr himself has very strong words to say as to what the Eucharist is. He says, "We call this food Eucharist, and no one is permitted to partake of it except one who believes our teaching to be true. For not as common bread nor common drink do we receive these, but since Jesus Christ our Savior was made incarnate by the Word of God and had both flesh and blood for our salvation, so too, as we have been taught, the food which has been made into the Eucharist by the Eucharistic prayer set down by him and by the change of which our blood and flesh is nourished is both the flesh and blood of that incarnated Jesus."
Right.
So this is the thing, is like oftentimes I'll get into these conversations. They'll be like, "Eric, let's focus on the majors. We can major on the majors, minor on the minors." I'm like, here's the problem. According to the Scriptures themselves, where St. Paul says, if you eat and drink the blood of Christ improperly, you're eating and drinking judgment on yourself, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and 10. And then Jesus himself saying, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. And the church herself saying that the Eucharist is the source and summit of the Christian life. It's everything. If something that is core from day one of Christianity to today,
right?
It's like we have to come to a conclusion. And real quick, Pat, you can't just say it's like it's symbolic and it's not a big deal to me. That doesn't mean it's not a big deal to Catholics. Like, this is a major thing. If it's symbolic, then Catholics are idolaters because we're worshiping the Eucharist, Jesus Christ himself. If it is Jesus himself, then you ought to become Catholic.
Correct.
Or at least Orthodox. I mean, so there is a big reason why, like, this is a huge deal.
And this was, I know we've had this conversation a lot before, but since we're going to be airing this on all of our podcasts, we'll just have to reiterate some of it. So if anybody else has heard us have these, give these arguments before, well, welcome back. But I mean, for me, right, there is, like, when I went back, because I wanted to get this right. And this is where I actually push back against C.S. Lewis's mere Christianity. There is no mere Christianity. There isn't, right? Like, either this is what Catholics claim to be, or it's like a terrible sin. And there's no middle ground there. Either this is what Christ gave to us, the gift, the most intimate relationship we can have with Christ, which is the sacraments, right? And specifically the Eucharist. And this is where we can see that religion, proper religion, is relationship. Right? Religion, the Catholic religion, is just us responding to how God wants us to have a relationship with him, which is by joining his church, entering into God's family through baptism, and partaking of the sacraments. With the Eucharist as the source and summit of the Christian life. That is how God wants us to have the most intimate relationship with him here on earth, to receive, and it's total reception. We don't earn that at all. We receive it. And when I was looking at the earliest Christians, it was just overwhelming, right? So not only do you have the scriptural evidence, which we've given before, and I don't know if it's worth going over the typology again, but seeing how the Eucharist is prefigured in the Old Testament. And then, just the certain things like, the old Passover meal where you had to have, I had to have an unblemished lamb. How does that relate to Christ as the sinless victim, right? And you had to spill the lamb's blood, but importantly, you had to eat the lamb. You had to eat the lamb to satisfy the Passover. Well, same thing. Everything in the new is always necessarily higher and more elevated than the old. That Christ is the new Passover feast. And that would mean that we literally have to eat Christ and partake in his glorious resurrected body as well. So when you understand again, the old in light of the new and the new in light of the old, it just builds the case that much more for the specific passages the Catholics would typically look to, like John 6 and things like that. And then when you build in the surrounding evidence of all the earliest Christians, it's overwhelming. The Eucharist was not something that was contested. It was something that was assumed that they would make arguments for other things on the basis of the Eucharist, right? It was that fundamental of the real presence of transubstantiation. And when I realized this, and I saw that the earliest church was visible, hierarchical, unified, and sacramental, it was no doubt to me that this just was the Catholic Church from the beginning. And I just to say a few more things here is, I think, oddly enough, excommunication was kind of a big one for me to see that this had to be the Catholic Church, because you see in Scripture Christ saying, hey, if you have a problem, eventually you got to take it before the church. But how can you do that if the church isn't visible, isn't hierarchical, and doesn't have authority? You can't make sense of the church settling disputes, right? You can't make sense of schism, which the earliest Christians saw as one of the greatest possible sins, right? You see how the earliest Christians, some of the sources Eris talked about schism, and it should send a shiver up your spine, because like, this is terrible. But you can't make sense of schism unless you have a visible, hierarchical, and authoritative church. And then another thing is just to talk about the indefectibility of the church. And there's two passages from Matthew that I want to read that I think really, and indefectibility, meaning the church, according to Christ's promise, will endure until the end of time here on earth. And it will never become corrupt, specifically in morals, faith, sacraments, and authority. Of course, people in the church can be corrupt. They always have been since Judas, since our first pope denied Jesus. Like, people are corrupt, but the church herself, as the mystical body of Christ, guided, protected by the Holy Spirit, can never become corrupt in faith, morals, sacraments, or authority. Let me just read these two passages from Matthew, and then Eric, I want to get your comments. First one is Matthew 7:24-27. And it reads, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house upon the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house upon the sand, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell. And great was the fall of it." Skip ahead just a little bit in Matthew 16:18-19. It reads this. This is Christ establishing, passing on his authority to the church. And let's just appreciate this connection, right? "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Now, a lot of Catholics, I think, just make the argument from Matthew 16 alone, and I think that can be done. But when we see it in relation to Matthew 7, what we see when we see Christ teaching what it means to build something upon a rock, right, which is endurability, right? And then this makes so much more sense when he founds his church on the rock of Peter, the first pope. And he changes Peter's name there, right? And the only time somebody has a name change in Scripture is when something really important is happening, right? They're assuming some type of special role. It makes no sense that he would receive a name change, especially in connection to rock, unless there's some type of special authority and designation and mission being given to him. So I want to get your thoughts on any other further thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we must be doers of the word, not just hearers, right? So we ourselves need to have a strong faith built on rock, but also the church herself, like you said, is built on, well, obviously Jesus Christ is the chief cornerstone. I want to get that out there. But he also shares, he lets us participate in his own life, and he lets certain people participate in certain functions. Like, we don't all have the same role in the body of Christ. And so the very cornerstone-shipness, the rockness of his headship of the church, he shares with Peter and the apostles. That's not saying that Christ isn't the supreme head, that he's the source of it all. It's just to say that he appointed Peter as the visible head of the church. And, a lot of times Protestants will point out, well, like in Greek, it says Petra and then Petros. Petra means rock. Petros just means small pebble. And it's like, well, those are just Greek terms that are used because of gender. Like, you wouldn't use Petra for Peter because he's not a girl.
Right.
But in the Aramaic, it's Kepha. And the word for rock is Kepha. There's no change.
Mhm.
And that's what he's called in John. He's called that in Paul's letters. He's called that in the book of Acts, Kepha, rock. Furthermore, he's given the keys of the kingdom of God. This is huge. This goes back to Isaiah chapter 22, where in the kingdom of God, the kingdom of Israel, there was the king, but there was also the steward, the chief steward. And this chief steward in Isaiah 22 was actually being removed from his office, and there was going to be a replacement, and he was going to be given the key of David. So when Jesus gives the keys of the kingdom to Peter and Peter alone, he's appointing him an office to be the steward, the chief steward, which if you read the parables of Jesus, he says, who then can be the wise steward who his master will set over all his possessions? Well, he sets Peter over all his possessions in John 21 when he gives him charge, tend my sheep, feed my flock, all of them. He's, of course, restoring Peter from denying him, but he's also giving him an office, a charge to feed all of the sheep, all of the lambs. He's making him the chief steward. And so that's why in the book of Acts, we see that when there's disputes, they have to have a council, and they ultimately go to Peter and say, hey, and of course, like in the Council of Jerusalem, James is the, one that's the bishop of Jerusalem. So he's like the one that ends up making the draft and everything. But Peter, it's when Peter speaks, it goes silent. When Peter speaks, it's like, okay, Peter has spoken. Now, how do we see this lived out? Like you could say, here's what I'm getting to with the Eucharist, with this as well. There's even a more fundamental layer that I think is just so important to hammer on when it comes to evidence for the Catholic Church, and that is, okay, if you believe that I'm misinterpreting Matthew 16 and I'm popicizing it, whatever, well, how do we know which interpretation is correct? If you think I'm just making it up about the Eucharist in John chapter 6, and you're like, no, well, I believe it's symbolic. Okay, but why? Well, we have evidence from Scripture that it actually is the body and blood of Christ. We have evidence from Scripture that the church is built on Peter. Okay, let's say we have a 50-50 shot, like the Pascal's wager. Let's say we have a 50-50 shot. It's like, okay, maybe you're right, maybe I'm wrong. Let's go back to the early sources. Outside the Bible, I know that's a little uncomfortable for Protestants. No, just Bible. But we already agreed we can't just rely on the Bible, because I'm coming at a radically different conclusion just using Scripture, actually.
Right.
Just using Scripture. We both have the Holy Spirit in us, and so we can't just say, well, the Holy Spirit's guiding me into all truth. Well, we both have the Holy Spirit. Are you saying, like, what are you saying by that? What if the Holy Spirit has been guiding the church into all truth, and the Lord himself? When I was charismatic, in the charismatic world, it was all about hearing God's voice. And it's like, listen, if I'm getting something that contradicts what God has said in the past, I'm wrong. I'm sorry, I'm just wrong, because God doesn't contradict himself. So here's the conclusion. If you do not believe that the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, if you do not believe that the church was founded on Peter, like these big claims, you have to give a lot of concession. Basically, you come to the conclusion of, like, if I were to say that the Eucharist is just symbolic and symbolic only, I am disagreeing with at least the first 1,500 years of all of Christianity. All of the saints, St. Augustine, I'm disagreeing with him. St. Thomas Aquinas, disagreeing. St. Ignatius of Antioch, a disciple of the Apostle John, I'm disagreeing with him. And so it's like, okay, well then who are you ultimately disagreeing with? Jesus, the one who established the church.
Right. And we talked about this before, that, how influential our paradigms are. And we're often raised in certain paradigms. And we have to be able, in order to compare paradigms, we have to be able to step out of a paradigm. We have to be able to at least think imaginatively. Okay, can I think, and this is not just true for religion, but also, ethics. It's really important in ethics. Like, can I think like a utilitarian, to try and compare utilitarian ethics to, say, virtue ethics or natural law? And if I think like, say, a natural law ethicist, right, might I expect the problems to happen if I were a utilitarian? And do they happen? Okay, if they do, then maybe there's a problem with utilitarianism. So part of imaginative thinking, be able to step outside of paradigms, is one way to evaluate paradigms, actually. So you have to be able to, just for the sake of, I think, just, honest exploration, just to what Eric is saying, okay, maybe I still believe this paradigm, but let me step out of this paradigm. And if I enter into a Catholic paradigm, might I predict some of the problems that I seem to be running into in my current paradigm? And can the Catholic paradigm resolve those problems? And I think we both are, yes, it does. It resolves them very well, because this is the church that God founded. He didn't intend for people just to take a book and go sit by themselves with it and try and figure it all out themselves. And one reason for that is God is not a God of confusion, and God wouldn't ask for the impossible. First off, we didn't have a Bible, right, as we know it, until, really the 4th century when the Catholic Church closed the canon. Right. But the Bible would have also been enormously cost prohibitive, and the vast majority of people wouldn't have been able to read it anyways. So if like sola scriptura, going by the Bible alone, is necessary for salvation, like that seems really weird. Like, why would God ask the impossible of people? But you don't have that problem if you have the church, right? Because the church could settle disputes. You didn't even have to have a closed canon, really, because the church could, through her authority, settle disputes as they arose. It just wasn't and wouldn't have been a major concern, right? But there's deeper problems, I would say, and Catholics can, of course, kind of defend the Catholic position, what we'd be doing here, but we can push it a little further and say, look, there are deeper problems with the notion of sola scriptura itself, the idea that you have to go by the Bible alone. I just pointed out one, but 3 other big ones is that no book is self-interpreting, which you just hinted at, Eric, right? And we have now thousands of different denominations of Christianity that all claim to have the right interpretation of a book that is apparently self-interpreted. It makes no sense, right? No book is self-interpreting. No book can tell you what should be included in that book, right? We need to step out of that to figure that out. Again, not a problem with the Catholic Church. If the church has authority, we can trust that church's authority when it is applied to the canon of Scripture. And 3, no book can tell you how to apply its lessons in a modern day context or its consequences in a modern day context. Again, not a problem with the Catholic Church because we have the magisterium, the ongoing teaching of the Catholic Church to help us apply these things. So I think that these sort of fundamental problems that you run into with sola scriptura, which is the kind of overriding Protestant paradigm. Of course, you can't reduce all of Protestantism to that because there's divergent beliefs, but it's kind of one of the certainly overriding paradigms. I would expect those problems as a Catholic. Those problems seem to occur, and those problems are resolved in the Catholic paradigm. You just don't run into those. And I think that that's also very important to recognize as well.
Yeah, and what you're pointing out to with the magisterium, which is the Pope in union with the bishops, in union with the Pope throughout the world, the teaching authority of the church, they're a living voice to interpret both sacred scripture and sacred tradition. So it's not enough even just to look at the early church fathers and make your own conclusions. We have to have a living interpreter that's given the authority. And I think what we see from the scriptures and the tradition, the sacred tradition, is that authority was given to Peter and the apostles and passed down to their successors. One of the earliest evidences we have is actually the letter of the 4th Pope, Pope Clement. He writes a letter to the Corinthian church, which wasn't even in his jurisdiction if you think that the Pope only had jurisdiction in Rome, because he's writing to the church in Corinth with the leaders. And furthermore, it's estimated that it's written around 86 AD, which is before the book of Revelation is done by the Apostle John. So the Apostle John is still alive, but somehow Pope Clement is the one that writes authoritative to this church. Why? Well, because he's the successor of Peter. And furthermore, this letter, First Clement, almost got accepted into the canon of Scripture. It didn't, because it wasn't written by an apostle or an eyewitness an eyewitness to the events, but it almost did. It was actually part of the liturgies for like 300 years, this letter. So that's strong evidence alone. And that's first century evidence of like the Pope's role in exhorting churches beyond his diocese.
And it's actually interesting, right? Because this actually appealed to me in kind of initially kind of weird way. The fact that the church didn't include that in the canon of Scripture was interesting to me, because like if you just think that the church is this oppressive, power-hungry regime that wants to justify itself, including something like Clement would have been very useful, because it speaks so clearly of these teachings. But it said, no, this isn't inspired Scripture. And the best explanation for that is because the church actually has authority to determine what is or isn't. Because, I mean, Clement, I think, is strong evidence in favor of the Catholic Church, but yet the Catholic Church did not include that in the canon of Scripture.
And also, like, you know, St. Augustine said, if apart from the authority of the Catholic Church, I would not believe the Gospels. And most Protestants like St. Augustine. So just think about that. Apart from the authority of the Catholic Church, I would not believe the Gospels.
Right. Let me,
Wow.
I actually have St. Augustine up right now. Let me
Yeah,
just read
yeah.
this really quick. St. Augustine says, in the Catholic Church, there are many things which most justly keep me in her bosom. The consent of peoples and nations keep me in the church. So does her authority, inaugurated by miracles, nourished by hope, enlarged by love, established by age. The succession of priests keeps me, beginning from the very seat of the apostle Peter, to whom the Lord, after his resurrection, gave it charge to feed his sheep, down to the present episcopate. Right? And so lastly, does the very name Catholic, which without reason, amid so many heresies, the church has thus retained, so that though all heretics wish to be called Catholics, yet when a stranger asks where the Catholic Church meets, no heretic will venture to point to his own chapel or house. Such then, in number and importance, are the precious ties belonging to the Christian name, which keep a believer in the Catholic Church as it is right they should. With you, where there is none of these things to attract or keep me, no one shall move me from the faith which binds my mind with ties so many and so strong to the Christian religion. For my part, I should not believe the gospel except as moved by the authority of the Catholic Church.
Man, that's so powerful. And okay, St. Ignatius of Antioch. We mentioned him already. He was a disciple of the Apostle John. He wrote 7 letters, and these are basically he's on his way to martyrdom, writes 7 letters to 7 churches, 6 churches, and Polycarp, actually, his friend. And so disciple of the Apostle John, and he's saying this. Similarly, this is his letter to the Trallians, and this is written around 107 AD. Similarly, let everyone respect the deacons as Jesus Christ, just as they should respect the bishop, who is a model of the Father, and the presbyters, or priests, as God's council and as the band of apostles. Without these, no group can be called a church. So I'm reading this as a Protestant. I'm like, who's my bishop? What's a bishop? What? Like, I thought I was part of a church. This is why to this day, the Catholic Church, only would call a group a church if they have a valid bishop, which a valid bishop is someone who's in apostolic succession. So the authority was passed down, which is why we refer to Protestant churches as not churches, but as ecclesial communities. They're still part of the body of Christ by virtue of their baptism. They are our brothers and sisters in Christ for sure. But when it comes to like what the church actually is, visibly, they still have to be fully incorporated. They have to be confirmed and receive the Eucharist. And actually, St. Ignatius, again, this is in his letter to the Smyrnians, says this, now note well those who hold heretical opinions about the grace of Jesus Christ that came to us. Note how contrary they are to the mind of God. They have no concern for love, none for the widow, none for the orphan, none for the oppressed, none for the prisoner or the one released, none for the hungry or the thirsty. They abstain from Eucharist and prayer, because they refuse to acknowledge that the Eucharist is the flesh of our Savior, Jesus Christ, which suffered for our sins and which the Father by his goodness raised up. And he goes on to say, I just love it. I just have to read it because he talks about where can we find this Eucharist? It's only with a valid bishop. This is coming from the disciple of the Apostle John. That's just so crazy. Flee from divisions as the beginning of evils. You must all follow the bishop as Jesus Christ followed the Father. And follow the council of presbyters as you would the apostles. Respect the deacons as the commandment of God. Let no one do anything that has to do with the church without the bishop. Only the Eucharist, which is under the authority of the bishop or whomever he himself designates, is to be considered valid. Wherever the bishop appears, there let the congregation be. Just as wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church. It is not permissible neither to baptize nor to hold a love feast without the bishop. But whatever he approves is also pleasing to God, in order that everything you do may be trustworthy and valid.
Wow. And this, I just want to point out how much this just explodes the common caricatures and myths that you hear of, wasn't it Constantine that established the Catholic Church, right? This was way before Constantine, my friend.
Right.
Way before
We have
Constantine.
the order of bishops, priests, deacons, presbyter. To this day, the priests in the diocese are known as the presbyterate, the group of elders. And the English word for priest is coming from that word presbyterer.
And Eric, I just want to point out a part of what you write, just so it doesn't miss it. It shows that the Eucharist is inexplicably bound up in the authority of the church, right? Exactly. It's not something we can pull out or separate.
Yeah. So I think those are the fundamental things that ultimately, there's a couple things that I would have people just consider. Like, this is what kind of started me on the path, is like, okay, how can I be sure I'm interpreting this correctly? All right, well, isn't the best, like, shouldn't I at least give consideration to what the earliest Christians taught? Because we both can't be right if we're coming to two different conclusions about a given scripture. We're both valuing the scripture completely and believing it's the word of God. But the good news is that the Holy Spirit has been guiding the church into all truth. Like, he's still with us. Jesus is still with us, in the Eucharist especially. And this is good news. We don't have to play Christian agnostics. We can't just be like, well, we just can't know. Your interpretation is your interpretation. We can't be Christian relativists. No, like, there actually is an interpretation that's correct. That's actually Jesus himself. If we want to call him Lord, we actually need to obey it.
Mm-hmm. And this is, oh man, sorry, John, when you air this and listen to this, because you're like, man, you guys just went on and on. But, you're like, it's kind of funny to see the procession here. Like, we start with some, like, kind of abstract philosophical arguments, and like, look, that's inherently like less messy. It doesn't mean it's less difficult, right? Sometimes it's very difficult to think abstractly, but like, we can proceed like deductively to a conclusion.
Yeah.
Once we get into history, like, okay, we got to gather evidence. We got to try and make inferences to the best explanation. So it's just the nature of the conversation is always just going to be, I think, a little bit more expansive. But I would ask people to keep a couple things in mind. One is keeping in mind the prior steps that we've made, right? The arguments for God's existence and a specific type of God, right? The God of classical theism that is all good, all loving. Might he not only incarnate and might he, sign off on something so miraculous as the resurrection, and might he leave us with something like the Catholic Church to guide us, to be that, as it says in 1 Timothy 3:15, the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of truth, right? Might that make sense that God would want to give us that assurance and might give him himself? And might it make sense that the church has endured for 2,000 years, given that? Like, does that make sense? Like, what other bumbling human bureaucracy can you point to? The answer is none, right? Like, and this is funny. I talked to a couple of my friends who aren't Catholic, and this is like when I was first coming into the church, and I was kind of discussing this with them, and one of them is Hindu, and he acknowledged that. He's like, there's something very weird about the Catholic Church, just the fact that it's just been around for so long. Like, it's so fantastically odd, right? Yeah. Unless you look at it through a Catholic paradigm, then it's not odd. Then it makes sense. Of course it's going to be here. Christ promised it would be, right? Like, what like, and that's actually kind of interesting, right? In the sense that Catholicism is falsifiable, right? In a sense, like, there's certain things that could happen that would make me think I was wrong, right? Like, if the church changed authoritatively her teachings on the Trinity, for example, I'd be like, I'm wrong. I was wrong.
I'm wrong. Yeah.
I'm wrong, right?
Yeah.
But that's never happened. That's never happened. And it's preserved these essential teachings of faith and morals despite the changes in culture and the times and all the various stresses and forces against the church. It has endured. And that it should make everybody take a serious step back and be like, okay, maybe you don't think it's miraculous, but at least you got to think that it's weird. And weird is a start. Weird is a good start, right? Like, there's a weirdness here. Let me look into the weirdness, and then we can go from there. And the other thing I'll keep in mind Pascal's wager, right? If this even seems remotely plausible to you, right, then if Catholicism is true, the most important thing you could do in life is find this intimate relationship with God. God wants you to have this deep, intimate relationship with him. This is the point of life. This is the purpose of life. And if that's even remotely possibly true, then I think everybody owes it themselves. The rational course of action isn't to fake belief. Nobody's saying go fake. You can't fake belief, right? It's very hard to believe something you don't believe. You just can't do it. But what you can do is you can seek, and you can start the journey, and you can start the process. And there's ways that you can do that. You can start, like John said, by praying conditional prayers, reading scripture, going to mass, right? You won't be able to avail yourself of the sacraments yet, but you can go to mass, or RCIA, right? There's rites. And if the RCIA, the rite of Christian initiation for adults, for example, it's not a commitment. And I know I have tons of people from my podcast all the time saying, hey, I'm looking into RCIA. What should I expect? And just don't expect anything. Just find RCIA.
Ask questions.
Just go. Yeah. Ask questions. Go. And just there's no harm in being a seeker is what I'm saying. And so wherever these arguments and evidences that we've given you, wherever you are on the kind of scale here, whether you're atheist, agnostic, spiritual but not religious, Christian but not Catholic, whatever, there's no harm in seeking and trying to learn more. And it would actually, once you're at a certain threshold of possible belief, right? If you think maybe it's 50% true, that's when Pascal's wager kicks in and say it would be irrational not to seek because of everything you have to possibly gain versus everything that you could potentially miss out on. And that's important to keep that in mind because it lowers the barriers to entry, and it can incentivize you to a very important action, even if you aren't absolutely certain. And I think that's key. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll just close with this, Pat, because we've covered a lot of ground today, and like I mentioned, like it was convicting to me to be like, okay, if I disagree about the Eucharist or the nature of baptism, that it actually saves us, which it says that in 1 Peter, and Jesus himself affirms that you must be born of water and spirit, or else you can't enter the kingdom. If I'm disagreeing with those things, I'm disagreeing not just with like my own interpretation of the scripture. I'm disagreeing with like the interpretation of all the saints that have gone before me. And Pope Benedict XVI says this is the greatest apologetic for the Catholic Church are the lives of the saints. And when you see there's a commonality, and they live this radical life of total gift of self, of that total love, of like going to the cross for even their enemies. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. They have this radical love of God and of neighbor. And they also have this radical love for the Eucharist, this radical love for his church. And so it's like, you can't just separate the two. I always come back to St. Joan of Arc's quote, because Jesus Christ himself made an indissoluble marriage between him and the church, the Catholic Church, the church that he started. Indissoluble, like nothing. Let no man separate that. That's why division is so bad. It's like divorcing Jesus' own marriage to the church. That St. Joan of Arc says, concerning the church and Jesus Christ, all I know is that they're just one thing, and we shouldn't complicate the matter. And as St. Augustine says, he says we need to have the perspective of the total Christ, head and body. When we separate Jesus from his holy Catholic Church, we decapitate the body of Christ. So the good news is you can come into full communion with the Catholic Church. You can experience totus Christus, the total Christ. The Christ who lives his life continually through his saints and through the church and through the sacraments. The Christ who is still head of the church. The Christ who is married to his church. And so I would just encourage everyone, explore, seek, and you will find. And as for me, like my own testimony is I find so much peace. I'm no longer a child tossed to and fro about every wind of doctrine, like it says in Ephesians. But because of the gifts he gave to his church, the apostolic authority, I have peace. It's beautiful.
Amen to that. And I'll just say one last thing, and I promise we will wrap this up here, is that it's just kind of interesting. I look back on my own journey too, and like every day I would drive by multiple Catholic churches, right, before I was Catholic. And, I think, I can't wait till you knock that thing down and put in a pizza spot, right? But like it was there all along. And I just think how many times I just drove by it, ignored it. And like, that was the thing that I was looking for all along. And that's just interesting to me, right? It was right in front of me all along. And eventually one day I just went in, right? And I guess the rest is kind of history, right? And look, I'm not getting like, this is kind of silly. I'll say it like, it's not like if you email me like, Pat, I'm going to sign up for RCIA. It's not like the Pope is cutting me a check, right?
Right.
It's like I want to share this because I think that it's true. And I care about all of you, anybody who's listening. Yeah. And I want us all to benefit and share in this. But yeah, that's it. That's good. We've gone on a while here. But yeah, it just popped in my mind of all the times I would drive and I'd be going through all these, these issues in life, the suffering, which we're going to talk about next episode too, and these philosophical problems, and it was there all along, and how easily I dismissed it, but it was right there. So anyways, all right, so we'll wrap up here. On the next roundtable, we are going to dive into the problem of evil and suffering. How do we reconcile this, both philosophically and emotionally? And that's what we're going to spend that conversation on. Eric, John, who is no longer with us, but we'll just we'll close out here. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to the next conversation.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.